Welcome to Basonico, where you're with good hands. In this episode, we will look at every single black ink pen, specifically those costing less than 15 pesos, which I've purchased from Paper World, a local Filipino school supply store. Now, by no means is Paper World the ultimate final source of quality writing instruments, but I believe it's stores like that which better reflect the average Filipino's experience when it comes to buying pens. Now, since this is my first pen review video, I feel it's only fitting that I properly introduce myself so that you'll understand who I am and why I'm doing all this instead of more meaningful things like getting a job or going to sleep or solving world poverty. This will be a relatively long intro, so if you want to skip straight to the tests, you can jump to the timestamp right over here. Now, let's go. Who am I? I am Basonico. I am a student who's been very interested in pens for quite some time now. In the process, I've learned a lot of things and a lot of standards to look for when buying pens, and so I feel it's only fair to give a little bit back to the community. Here are some disclaimers. Number 1. I am not sponsored by any of these pen brands. My channel is barely even starting out. What makes you think that some people are going to go over and say, we're going to pay you $100 to showcase our specific pen from this lineup? No, I'm not there yet. Number 2. Although I will be testing each pen under a variety of tests, those tests will be more on the practical writing side. Hence, I will not be testing things like the ink's archival quality, whether it's acid-free or not, or whether it's safe under airplane cabin pressurization, etc. Practical writing. That's what we're going to be focusing on. Number 3. Virtually none of these pens are from the 4 established Japanese stationery brands that often get talked about in Philippine pen review contexts. The usual suspects: Pilot, Uniball, Zebra, Pentel. None of these pens come from those brands. In this video, we will be focusing on whether these less than 15 peso pens offer qualities that can be considered good enough for more budget-conscious users. And that brings us to number 4, because by the end of this video, I'm going to be recommending some of these pens. Those recommended pens are going to have affiliate links in my description down below, wherein you can buy them in bulk and I'll earn a percentage. So if you buy what I recommend, you also get to help me and my channel. It's a win-win. With that, let's proceed straight to the test proper. What are we going to do to these pens? Well, first, we're going to give them a bit of a once-over, maybe note some aesthetic details, or if they have grips, if any. This thing doesn't seem to have a grip. Anyway, after we note their appearance, we're going to do the actual tests. Our first test is going to be a line test where I'm going to draw 3 lines to see whether the ink has some basic skipping. Number 2, we're going to do 3 zigzag tests to see whether more rigorous writing action is going to stimulate or induce more skipping. After that, we're going to do a bunch of curves and swirls for line consistency and integrity. After that, we're going to do a smear test where I'm going to draw a bunch of lines, and then after 3 seconds, I'm going to run my finger over those lines to see whether the ink smudges, because that is important for some people, especially for lefties like me, who tend to get their hands on the paper a lot. And then finally, a sentence test wherein I'm going to be writing using the pen the sentence, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog," which is a sentence that uses all letters of the English alphabet. Hence, it's going to result in a more comprehensive writing experience using the pen. And with that, we can also judge the pen's writing feel, how it feels when we're actually using it. And we're also going to be able to note whether the ink from that sentence test is going to bleed through. By the way, all of these tests are going to be done on this notebook paper. And no, it's not from Rhodia, it's not from Hobonichi, it's not from Moleskine. No, this is from Sterling Paper, a local brand as far as I'm aware. I've also not done research into this, but as far as I'm aware, these Sterling notebooks are the kinds of notebooks that you will more likely than not find in those school supply stores like Paper World. And with that, let's start with our first pen, the Papermate Kilometrico F. Now, upon first glance, it kind of looks like a standard big crystal. And in fact, this is the cheapest pen of the bunch. This costs only 5 pesos. You're not really gonna get a much cheaper pen than that. Now, while it does look like a big crystal, the tip is quite different. As you can see, the tip is a bit clearer and there's a bit more of a taper towards here. I mean, that will help a bit in terms of writing vision. Now, it says over here, if it'll focus, F. Now, I don't know what kind of tip size that specifically means, but based on Pilot's own classification of their tips, F would be equivalent to 0.7 millimeters. So let's assume that this is a 0.7 millimeter pen. Let's start with the line test. Over here, starting. So we're gonna go 1, 2, 3. Now, if we look at the lines, it seems that the paper-made Kilometrico is quite consistent in its line quality, and the ink also seems to be quite dark, which is surprising performance for a 5 peso pen. But let's proceed straight to the zigzag tests. 1, 2, and 3. So, since this seems to be a standard oil-based ballpoint pen, it seems that there are some parts where the ink is a little lighter than the others, but overall, there seems to be no serious skipping issues with this pen, which is already quite impressive. It's punching quite a bit above its weight. Let's see the circles. 2, 3, 4, and 5. In terms of line consistency, this also seems to be holding up pretty darn well. I don't see any parts where it seems to fade. I mean, there's a bit of a skip at the start, but given that it's an oil-based ballpoint pen, I think you can kind of expect that. But now for the smear test. We're gonna do 1, 2, 3. Alright, so as you can see, there is in fact a bit of smudging, but it's not too atrocious. However, since this is an oil-based ballpoint pen, I would expect it to have had maybe a bit less smudging than this compared to gel pens, which tend to smudge more. And we might get to test that later with these other pens, but now let's proceed with the writing test for the sentence. So we're gonna write over here. By the way, I'm not gonna be writing in cursive because, well, that would take too much time. Over the lazy dog. Alright. So I kind of messed up a bit here at the start, but it's fine. So, it seems that based from our test, the paper-made Kilometrico kind of holds up. This part over here, there was a bit of lightness, but it generally tends to maintain an overall decent ink quality throughout the rest. We also have some slightly thinner spots here, but the most important thing that I seem to get from this pen is that there is practically no skipping. Maybe a bit of dry spots, but not really skipping. And I find that really nice, especially for a pen that sells as low as 5 pesos. Later on, we will see whether this is in fact the best bang for your buck pen among this lineup. But so far, as to whether or not I will recommend this pen, yes. It's cheap and it's not really flashy, but it seems to have decent quality and it will definitely get the job done, yes. Number 2, we have the Tempo Silk. This seems to be one of those click-clack types of pens, kind of like the HBW Matrix. And, okay, I do not like that action. It's kind of unreliable, and it's not comfortable. It doesn't sit in there very comfortably. I mean, this is basic after all. This only costs 7 pesos, 2 pesos more expensive than the paper-made Kilometrico. And, okay, at least it's not capped. Anyway, enough on the aesthetics. Let's proceed with the writing test. So here, line test. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it seems to be equally consistent as the paper-made Kilometrico. As for the darkness, they seem to be roughly equal so far. Zigzag tests. Let's go here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it's kind of performing similarly to the paper-made Kilometrico, which is kind of expected since this is also seems to be a standard oil-based ballpoint. However, it does seem that the ink is a bit darker than that of the paper-made, so maybe if you want a darker, more vivid-looking line of writing in your notes, you might consider this. Next for curves. 4, 5. Honestly, I'm quite impressed. These cheap pens are maintaining good line integrity and consistency all throughout. None of them have really shown any signs of skipping. The Tempo Silk, although it does have a darker ink, seems to have a bit more of a tendency to thin out in some parts, although that difference compared to the Papermate is kind of negligible, really. Smear test. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there seems to be just ever so slightly less skipping than the Papermate Kilometrico, and I think this might just perform better as well in the sentence writing test. So number 2, the Quick Brown Fox. Oh, and by the way, my handwriting in real life really is this crazy. Okay. So, number 2. It does seem to also have consistent writing performance and does indeed show that it has a bit of a darker ink than a Papermate Kilometrico. Now, if you will notice, there are some parts where it does kind of start to get a little light, such as again over here, and maybe a bit over here at the F, but really there's nothing serious. This is a generally reliable writing pen in terms of its ink performance. As for the feel of the pen itself, I think that the plastic body and the way that the grip is structured here makes it slightly less comfortable than the Papermate Kilometrico, which has a smooth body, which is quite convenient to hold. But at least with the Tempo Silk, you get a click, clack, click, clack, with no risk of losing your cap. Oh, and by the way, both of these pens are performing decently in terms of bleed through. We're not really seeing a lot of bleed through here, which is to be expected since they're ballpoint pens. Now, so, would I recommend this pen? Honestly, if you're a pure utilitarian who's just after ink performance, then yes, I recommend that you can buy this. However, in terms of the experience of writing, I think the Papermate is a bit better. It's a bit more comfortable because of the fact that the body is smooth. However, we're talking about utility here, so I'd still recommend this pen. Yes, buy this. Up next, we have our 8 peso pen, the AMSPEC Jot Black, and this time, they finally indicate the tip size. It says here, if it'll focus, 0.7 millimeters. It's really not focusing, so bear with me here. Anyway, so it turns out the bare minimum to indicate the tip size is 8 pesos. I'll keep that in mind. This has a very, very vibrant orange color, which might appeal to some people. It has some texture here for the grip, and overall it kind of reminds me of a very budget Faber-Castell LV, which unfortunately we're not going to be reviewing for this video, but maybe for the next. So, let's start. Writing test over here with the lines. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it does write with slightly thicker lines than the Tempo Silk and the Papermate Kilometrico, so which leads me to suspect that maybe the Papermate is actually a 0.5, as well as the Tempo Silk, since this is a 0.7. But since it's a 0.7, the strokes are also a bit richer. Now for the zigzag. Alright, so it seems that the AMSPEC Jot's ink is even darker than even the Tempo Silk, and it's also a bit more consistent. I'm not really seeing any light parts here. This is surprisingly good. In fact, for 8 pesos, this is quite good ink we got over here. Okay, we have similarly consistent results over here at the curve test. I'm seeing even more impressive line consistency than the Tempo Silk, and it's about as good as the Papermate, but it is in fact a bit thicker. And now for the smear test. 5, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it seems that the level of smudging here is about somewhere in between that of the Tempo Silk and the paper mate, so it does smudge a bit more than the Tempo Silk, which is a bit understandable because it is in fact a 0.7, so it's laying down more ink. Now for the writing test. Okay, so from what I'm seeing here, we got some generally really good performance here. It's about almost as black as a Pilot Acroball, which costs around 55 pesos from the same store. This is impressive ink for the price. Also, it's also smooth. There are almost no light points here. Maybe there are some minor skips over in some specific parts of the letters, but really, nothing serious. And as for bleed through, it's also essentially identical to the first two pens that we reviewed. So far, this is our leading pen among performance. As for the writing feel, this is a very lightweight pen, maybe even a bit more perceptibly lightweight than this because the weight of this is kind of concentrated because it's a bit shorter, whereas the AMSPEC Jot is this relatively long cap pen. And it's basically hollow plastic inside, I think. Now, would I recommend this pen? Absolutely yes. Get this pen. This is basically Acroball performance in an 8 peso package, maybe slightly minus the smudge resistance, but overall, a really excellent performing pen. So far, really good. Moving on. Next we have the Tempo Smooth Gel. This doesn't indicate specifically the tip size again, so I'm not sure. This costs 9 pesos, by the way, and this is the first pen that we've got that seems to be a gel pen. So it does have a grip section here, but it's also still made of just hard plastic that's been textured differently from the rest of the body. It's got a fine tip. I'm assuming this is either 0.5 again or 0.7. It looks pretty big though. I think it's a 0.7. Anyway, we're gonna speed run a bit of the tests here, so we're just gonna quickly go through all of them. Line test, zigzag, curve, and smear test. 1, 2, 3. Oh my goodness. Okay, so from what I'm seeing over here, alright, so it is a gel, but maybe it's also because of the way that I placed pressure on the papers I'm writing, but although these are in fact thick black lines, they tend to be a little thin in the middle, although I'm not sure if the camera captures that. Anyway, it does really feel smooth when writing. These zigzag tests were essentially nothing to the Tempo Smooth Gel. It's performing very consistently, as well as in the curve test. However, we're seeing significant degrees of smudging here, so if you're a left-hander, I don't know, I suggest maybe something else that is just as dark but a bit cleaner. But let's first complete this last test. By the way, this cap feels a little unwieldy to handle because, I don't know, it's a little flimsy. It also says, by the way, here, Japanese gel ink, so I don't know if this is from an established manufacturer or if it's just something niche, but let's go. Okay, so as expected, it is in fact very dark. It lays down this very dark line on the paper, and it's absolutely smooth. In fact, among all of them, this is so far the smoothest. Although, to be fair, the AMSPEC Jot for a ballpoint pen is still pretty darn good. Anyway, as for bleed through, surprisingly, it's doing better than what I expected on bleed through. Although it does seem that some parts are starting to bulge a bit more, but all in all, acceptable rates of bleed through. So, overall verdict, this is a really good performing pen. The only downside seems to be that it's absolutely not a smudge resistant ink. Even though I gave it 3 seconds, it's still smudged. So would I recommend this or not. Honestly, it's a bit of a 50-50. I mean, if you're all right with managing a bit of that smudge risk, then go ahead. But if you're finicky with cleanliness, then I don't know, maybe pick something else. But still, for 9 pesos, this is a really good performing gel, minus the smudge. But still, this is all right. Moving on to our next disposable rollerball design here. We have the Snowhite T16 in 0.5 millimeter. This costs 10 pesos. And really, the design just reminds me of one of those disposable rollerballs like Pilot Precise, etc. It's got this standard, really middle-of-the-road grip over here, very smooth. In fact, yeah, about as smooth as the Papermate Kilometricos, and that really, really fine tip. My camera is having problems focusing, but not anymore. So let's breeze through this. Alright, so let's do a quick recap. As for the lines, it seems to lay down good dark lines, but these are maybe not exactly as rich as the Tempo Smooth Gel's lines. However, they are still just as consistent, but I don't know, it has slightly more feedback on the paper, maybe because it's a bit of a needle tip. I'm not sure if you'd call it needle tip, but it does have slightly more feedback on the paper compared to the smooth gel. But it's still consistent with the curves, the zigzags. However, it does perform better than a Tempo Smooth Gel in terms of the smear test. There is far less smudging here compared to the Tempo Smooth Gel. Oh, and there's still a bit of smudging, but definitely much better performance. As for the sentence, you can see here, I'm not sure if the camera captures it, but it's ever so slightly less dark than the Tempo Smooth Gel. But in terms of consistency, it's generally fine, although it does tend to be a little liquidy in some parts. So letters like the O and the G, they kind of get muddled together. Or maybe that's just my handwriting, because, you know, I'm that kind of guy. Also, because since it's a rollerball pen that uses liquid ink formulation, it does tend to suffer a bit more bleed through here. So it's either you'd use it on thicker paper notebooks or, yeah, only on one side of the page. Now, would I recommend this pen? Yes. I honestly think it performs equally good as the Tempo Smooth Gel, maybe slightly better because at least it doesn't smudge as much. However, the downside is you might need to get some slightly better quality notebooks for it. This is an absolutely basic binder notebook, so I understand why there is a bit of bleed through. But other than that, would I recommend this pen? Yes, you can buy this. Up next, we have the M&G Office G. Oh, an interesting name. And it's in 0.5. The way that they put the branding over here, it's a little bright, but yeah. Anyway, M&G Office G 0.5. This seems to be, yeah, it's a gel pen. They specify that it's a gel pen. The body kind of looks again like another derivative of the Faber-Castell, but it does have a standard conical tip instead of a needle point like you would expect from a Pentel Energel. Now, let's breeze through the tests. Okay, first things first, when I write with this pen, it seems to have a slightly drier gel formulation than the Tempo Smooth Gel or the Snowhite T16 that we have just tested. And this really reflects in how it felt when I was writing the sentences. I mean, it actually looks really clean compared to the first two really dark ink pens that we've reviewed. But in some parts, like here, there's a chance that this pen might be a little inconsistent in terms of startup, but as for the rest, it seems to be performing decently. And the bleed through is acceptable. It's at a similar level as perhaps the AMSPEC Jot. As for the other parts over here, the line is it's kind of performing similar to the case of the Tempo Smooth Gel, if not a bit worse, since, again, the center is a bit thin in terms of ink generosity. Maybe that's because of the fact it's a little dry, but it's alright. Anyway, as for the zigzag, it's also generally consistent. It does seem to have some lighter parts in some of the larger crests and troughs over here, but nothing really horrible. As for consistency here, it's decent. However, it does start to thin out once you start drawing these more extended curves, such as this one. But thankfully, this doesn't seem to be a repeat issue. As for the smudge, it seems to have moderate smudge resistance. It seems to be somewhere in between the Tempo Smooth Gel and the Snowhite T16. So, overall, this does feel decent when writing, and it does give clean lines. However, the feedback might be a bit more than the others, in fact. For instance, the AMSPEC Jot, which is about its closest competitor so far, is even smoother, in fact, in writing compared to this. And the M&G Office G actually costs 12 pesos. This is one of our most expensive pens that we're going to review in this lineup. So, would I recommend this? No, I don't recommend this. This costs 4 pesos more than the AMSPEC Jot, but performs essentially the same, or if not slightly worse than the AMSPEC Jot. And since it's a gel pen, it's also going to run out faster than the AMSPEC Jot, which seems to be an oil-based ballpoint. So you can save your money. I wouldn't recommend this. Moving forward, we have the Panda S2500, or the Panda Sign Pen S2500 in black, 0.5 millimeters. Now, I'm familiar with Panda. I've used Panda pens since elementary, but this is the first time that I've seen Panda have their own take on the liquid rollerball pen system. And honestly, in terms of design, it seems a little better than the Snowhite T16. It's a bit on the thicker side, but the handling is kind of the same. This cost also 12 pesos, and in fact, every single pen from this point forwards is also going to cost 12 pesos. And with that, let's proceed with the tests. Alright, so initial thoughts. This is one of the most generous 0.5 millimeter pens that I've ever used. These lines are very, very thick. If you take a look at that, camera focus please. For a 0.5, this writes basically like a 0.7, and the ink is in fact just as, if not slightly darker, than the ink of the Tempo Smooth Gel. However, yes, as I expected, that means that so far, the Panda Sign Pen is the worst performing in terms of bleed through so far. You really don't want to stick to one place for too long with this pen. But let's look at the other tests over here. So, in terms of lines, it's very generous and consistent, unlike the M&G Office G or the Tempo Smooth Gel to an extent. Same goes with the zigzag tests. Nothing really reduced here. This one maybe has a slightly thinner line at some point. I don't know. Doesn't really seem to be a problem. Curve test over here, generally consistent, although it was maybe a smidge thin at the start. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is so far the leader of the smear test. There is essentially no smudging after 3 seconds. This is a relatively quick drying gel ink formulation, and it's honestly quite impressive. So, also in terms of writing experience, this was pretty fine. I mean, it's not really that much different compared to the Snowhite T16, but it's still pretty good. Now, would I recommend this? This costs 12 pesos. All in all, it writes really good for a rollerball. It also has really thick lines. The only real downside is that it does, in fact, suffer from bleed through, because after all, it's a rollerball pen. However, I would still recommend that you buy this because this can still be used in many situations. For example, I mean, it's in the name. It's a sign pen, so you can use this for signing, for more bold applications, etc. However, this is not necessarily the best for general purpose writing, especially when it comes to notes such as those in notebooks, because these thick lines will eventually clutter up your page and they might not look as orderly compared to the previous pens. But this is still a good pen. I would recommend this. Now, by the way, most of the pens that I have reviewed so far, I would actually recommend. However, only a few of them will in fact contain affiliate links, because after all these pens are going to be reviewed, I'm going to be issuing a final verdict as to perhaps top 3 pens that I would recommend from this batch. But moving on, second to the last, we have the Avanti Basic Gel Pen. It's going to be really hard to catch. There it is. Okay. Avanti Basic Ballpen, 0.7 millimeter. So another oil-based ballpoint. So I'm not assuming it's going to be darker than the Panda Sign Pen from previous. That might just be the darkest ink that we have in this whole lineup. But let's go. Also, that is a much more satisfying click-clack mechanism than the Tempo Silk, our only other representative of the... Oh, it even struggles to enter sometimes. It's not a really smooth action. Whereas this one, you just press, pap, press, pap. This is a much more ergonomically designed click-clack design, if that's how you call it. But we're also here to test its performance, so let's cut straight to the tests. Alright, so initial impressions, this pen is honestly disappointing. It costs 12 pesos. Again, one of the most expensive pens in our lineup. However, that ink lightness, I mean, I already expected it was gonna be lighter than gel ink, but this is even lighter than perhaps, this is the lightest ink that we have in the lineup. It's even lighter than the Papermate Kilometrico's ink. And it costs more than twice as much. The ink performance itself is also not that impressive. I'm seeing a lot of thin parts over here, some thin parts over here where the P is barely even formed, and yeah, a couple more minor light points over here. I mean, we're not gonna worry of anything at all about the bleed through, but if anything, the bleed through is in fact it's about the same as the Papermates. But the Papermates, for being a 5 peso pen, is actually a bit more impressive so far. As for the tests, the line test here is relatively consistent. However, it seems to have a bit more of a startup time here where it initially doesn't run any ink, but then it finally follows through. So it needs a bit of warm-up, I suppose. And then for the zigzags, we have some problems with the zigzag, even as an oil-based ballpoint. These previous ones, they did much better. This one has a bunch of thin points over here at the middle sections of the zigzags. Not really good. And then for the curve test, it tends to be a bit lighter when it's going clockwise. Over here, if you look at these circles, they might... I'm not sure if the camera will pick it up, but over here, it is a bit thinner when it's starting to go to the right. I don't know why. And then finally, it also has a bit of smudge over here. So, really, this pen is great ergonomically. It's got a good textured grip section, rubber grip section over here. The click-clack is really satisfying. I could see someone fidgeting with this for a while. But unfortunately, I will not recommend this pen. It's just not worth paying 12 pesos for a pen that writes worse than a 5 peso pen. Finally, last but not the least, we have this weird looking pen, the M&G M7, and in 0.7 millimeters. There you go. All right. So, this also costs 12 pesos, by the way. This cap is honestly a little too small for me, but I'm not sure that really matters. The tip is fine over here, kind of reminds me again of a Faber-Castell. However, let's address the elephant in the room. Instead of a tapered design like in most pens, such as, for example, this, it tapers down towards the end. This one flares. It flares up here and then has an indentation here, perhaps to accommodate gripping, and then finally tapering at the nose cone. Wait, is this? Yeah. The refill is also over here. You can see the refill. It's got that spiral refill that reminds me of basically Panda ballpoint pens, the kinds that me and my classmates used to use in elementary school. This pen seems very ergonomic. It's the tallest pen of the bunch, but it's lightweight, and the grip, while not being soft, provides some degree of cushioning, and I appreciate the fact that they have an indentation here. It allows my fingers to have a nice foothold inside. Foothold. It's very interesting. Anyway, this is comfortable to hold, but will it be good as an actual writing instrument? Let's see. Okay. So, right away, one of the first things that I noticed about this pen is that when writing with it, the tip wobbles. It's not a very stable tip. When I'm writing, I'm not sure if the camera picked it up, but if you're writing with it, the refill inside also kind of wobbles somewhat, and while that didn't really affect the stability all that much, it felt at times a little unstable when I was writing the sentence. But let's take a look at the ink. It's got decently dark ink, perhaps maybe about as dark as that of the AMSPEC Jot over here. In terms of consistency though, the ink is decent, however, it's not so uniform. We have some parts here where it downright didn't even write the top part of the K. There are some slight thin parts over here. However, apart from this K section, it seems to be performing decently. And as for bleed through, it's about the same as most of the other pens, except for the two roller balls over here, which understandably have worse bleed through. Now, as for the other tests, so it kind of failed to start up a bit at the 9, but the line test itself, it produces consistent lines, a bit of a startup, but still generally consistent lines. It did decently on the zigzag test, not much. It's performing a bit similarly to that of the AMSPEC Jot. And then, as for the curved lines, it's also generally consistent. Maybe a slight skip here, but nothing really major. And it's got decent smudge resistance. There's only a bit of smudging here after 3 seconds. This is a 12 peso pen. Would I recommend this? Well, it's not necessarily the best performing in terms of ink, and it's definitely not the best performing in terms of the actual, build quality. I'm not sure if this is just because this one has a bit of a problem. I don't know. But the writing feel, however, is unmatched. This is a lightweight pen that is comfortable, and if only the tip didn't wobble when I was writing, this would automatically be an instant recommend. But since it kind of wobbles, it's like similar to the Tempo Smooth Gel. I'm kind of torn, but ultimately, I'd still probably recommend it. Think of it like a 70-30. Even if you're not getting the best ink performance, at least you got a comfortable pen that's not going to stress out your fingers when you're writing for long writing sessions like this. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have completed every single black ink pen that has cost me less than 15 pesos each that I got from Paper World. And with all these tests that we've done, we're now going to determine which among all these pens am I ultimately going to recommend that you buy. I already mentioned earlier that a lot of them you could in fact buy, but among them, there are 3 pens that stand out the best. And I would recommend these to you for a lot of situations. They deliver a lot of solid performance per peso. Starting off at number 3, we have the Papermate Kilometrico. 5 pesos, with performance that beat even the 12 peso Avanti basic pen. This is absolutely a great pen for 5 pesos. The cheapest pen that you could buy in the lineup, and yet it doesn't, in fact, write like the absolute cheapest. This punches above its weight class, and the feel of the writing when you're using it is also good. All in all, for a 5 peso pen, definitely really good. I would recommend this. This is my top 3. Number 2. This was quite difficult for me since a lot of the pens performed quite decently. But if I really had to decide, number 2 would go to the Panda Sign Pen. I mean, sure, the Snowhite T16 had much less bleed through compared to the Panda Sign Pen. However, among all the rollerballs, this laid down the most generous lines, and thus this is a pen that is capable of producing really bold strokes that would really benefit certain specific writing contexts. As long as you're careful with the way that you're using this pen, it's gonna be quite of a fun pen to use. It's really smooth, and it comes from Panda. I mean, there's a bit of nostalgia there, but that's intangible. And now we have some honorable mentions. I'd still recommend these pens, but they're not necessarily within my top 3 because of very specific reasons. This one, the Tempo Smooth Gel, is definitely an honorable mention because it performed really well in almost every department. But as a left-handed person, I simply cannot fully recommend it because of the fact that it smudges a heck of a lot. So some people might like this simply because it's absolutely smooth, but it's not the cleanest among the pens. And I don't want smudgy writing, smudgy notes, smudgy things. So, an honorable mention. Another honorable mention is the M&G M7. This has a very interesting design, and it's definitely the most ergonomically minded pen. It handles well when you're writing, and the ink is not bad. But the point is, the ink itself is also not necessarily the best. And at 12 pesos, there are pens like the Papermate Kilometrico, which deliver already decent performance without you having to spend twice as much. I mean, it's crazy. Like, we're thinking that 12 pesos is a fortune, but compared to the value that the 5 peso Papermate Kilometrico was able to deliver, I'd really expect quite a lot from more expensive pens like this one. But that finally brings us to our top 1, the one that I'd recommend the most of them all. You seriously want to do this, guys. You want to have this pen. I mean, it looks a little janky, it's a little flashy, maybe intended for kids, that kind of color. But really, you can't go wrong with the AMSPEC Jot. The ink for an 8 peso pen is dark. It's, in fact, almost as dark. It's quite competitive even, compared to some of the other gel pens. It's a consistent writer. The pen body itself is light. The grip section, it doesn't dig into your fingers, so it's still comfortable when you're writing. And again, it's 8 pesos. This delivers the best performance overall out of all the pens that we've reviewed. And so all in all, we have this pen, followed by these other ones: the Tempo Smooth Gel, the Panda Sign Pen, the M&G M7, and the Papermate Kilometrico. The 5 budget pens below 15 pesos that I would recommend that you buy. But really, get this one, the orange. And with that, this has been Basonico. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, despite it being extremely long. So thank you very much for paying attention and sitting with me throughout all of this. But guys, the story doesn't end here. If we take a look at this bag, there are a bunch of pens that are awaiting analysis. But these are subject for the next video. So stay tuned and watch, as in the next video, we're going to be covering pens that are a bit more expensive but are still within our relatively budget price range. Once again, from Paperworld, this has been Basonico, and I hope that you've enjoyed this experience of being with good hands. Thank you.